We are speaking today post-recording of this original podcast to give you a short disclaimer. We're aware that there's been some negative press recently regarding various schemes set up to pay school fees. We would like to emphasise that the content of the podcast is very vanilla and does not constitute any tax schemes. So here's the rest of the podcast. We hope you enjoy it. Hello and welcome to this podcast from the Private Wealth team at Saffery Champness. My name is Leonora Stevens. I'm a partner in the Private Wealth team based in Bristol. And I'm joined virtually today by Mike Hodges, who's the head of private wealth at Saffery Champness, and Mike is based in Manchester. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Leo, and Manchester, according to the Sunday Times the other week, social capital of the UK. For your night, come to Manchester.
Very good. Today, our topic for discussion will be gifting by grandparents, specifically to the grandchildren, and what they should consider if they're settling school fees for their grandchildren. As always, I start by explaining why we're covering this topic. One of the most common questions we get asked by grandparents is how to efficiently give assets to their grandchildren. The main tax to consider here is, of course, inheritance tax, but capital gains tax can also be at play here if you're gifting assets instead of cash. Additionally, with the cost of living going up and school fees for independent schools increasing, grandparents who are able to are looking to help fund the education costs of their grandchildren, or at least provide assistance. So in this podcast, we will talk about the various ways of paying the school fees from a tax perspective and things that you should consider. Now, avid listeners of our podcast, Mike, will know that we've done 3 podcasts previously on gifting assets to children, which is including the use of trusts. And all of these can be found on our websites. But I think it's best to start discussing the payment of school fees, and as this seems to be quite a hot topic at the moment, and there have been lots of newspaper articles about how the costs of these things are going up. So there are various ways that grandparents can settle the school fees for their grandchildren and differing tax implications. I'll start by the simplest way. So it could be for the grandparents to pay the school fees directly. So some grandparents will think about doing this termly, or in some circumstances, they can arrange to make a large settlement for future fees upfront. Although with this sort of large upfront payment, I understand that sadly, this doesn't fix the future fees, so it doesn't cover the risk of the increase, but it is a good way to cover the bulk of fees. So what are the tax implications of doing this for the grandparent? So if we look firstly at the one-off payment, then this is likely to be treated as a potentially exempt transfer, known as a PET for RHT purposes. This means that if the donor survives 7 years from the date of gift, there will be no inheritance tax. But if the donor does actually die within 7 years of the gift, then there may be RHT, but this will be tapered down after 3 years from the date of the gift. Moving on to if grandparents make regular termly payments, then these will be treated as PETs. However, there is a potential for the payment to be deemed as a gift out of surplus income. Well, what does this mean, you may ask? Well, if the donor's got sufficient surplus income each year, then these payments are exempt from RHT and would fall out of the RHT net, so there's no 7-year clock. Many clients seem very interested in this point, as it is a very valuable RHT benefit. There's a really useful schedule on HMRC's website which can help you calculate your surplus income each year. This will look at all of your income, less your tax, less any of your annual costs, such as holidays, utilities, and the resulting figure is your surplus income that can be given away. I would add that the gifts should be regular in nature and well documented, hence why the large one-off payment of school fees would be unlikely to be covered by this exemption. However, with annual school fees sometimes reaching 50k per year per child, this relief may not apply to the majority of taxpayers, so may be of marginal use here, but definitely something to consider. I would add that gifts out of surplus income can also be made into a trust free of IHT, which leads me on nicely to my question to Mike. Another option for grandparents wanting to settle for the school fees is to set up a trust. Can you explain the mechanics and what sort of the tax implications of this are?
Yes, and I guess that the point, just going back to normal gifts out of income, there is no limit on that. So high income level taxpayers can make significant gifts, but turning to trusts, yes, more and more of my clients look at these. Different from the concept of a PET that you've already explained, in that they are chargeable to inheritance tax, but everyone has their £325,000 nil rate band. So if you have a single taxpayer, £325,000, but for a married couple, that can be £650,000. And then most people are comfortable with this concept of the 7-year clock for inheritance tax. So every 7 years you can refresh that. So over a reasonably long period, you can get quite significant value into a trust. And you are then saying, right, a pot of fees that or pot of cash rather, that you can use to pay fees, typically you would exclude parents. So grandparents are skipping a generation, going directly to their own grandchildren. The trust then becomes an entity in itself. So there's some complication there, but those are the sorts of things we deal with. The trustees are then the people who have income and capital, if they choose to apply to pay the school fees. So it's grandparents saying, we've got some surplus money, what do we do with that? To put it to one side. It indirectly benefits the parents because they're not having to fund the school fees, but in a technical sense, they can't benefit under the trust. And the beauty of trusts is really that the trustees, who can be whoever you pick, control. So grandchildren have this pot of cash, but they can't run amok. They can't get to 18 and say, right, here it's party time. So control, but an allocation of funds for grandchildren is really the secret here.
I would add that the grandparents can also be trustees of the trust as well, can't they?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So that's it really. It sounds sort of more complicated than it is. There are some complexities, but as I say, the professionals will deal with that. You will need a lawyer to draft a trust deed, but that shouldn't be too onerous. And a lot of people are doing it. They think it's really attractive. And the key there really is, I haven't said, that each child from birth has their own personal allowance. So that's where it becomes more tax efficient. The tax efficiency comes from the fact it's not grandparents or parents paying tax at higher rates or up to 45%. It's children who've got personal allowances and basic rate bands to take advantage of when the trustees have income that they distribute to the children by paying school fees, or in whatever way they choose to benefit the grandchildren.
Exactly, I suppose, because to recap on the trust tax, so the trust will pay tax at up to 45% on its income. Yes. And then when it distributes to the grandchild, who tends to be obviously a minor with no other income, that distribution to pay the school fees is deemed to have already suffered 45% tax on it. Yeah. So they do a reclaim form and they can get that 45% back.
Yes, and quite often in February or March of a year, we are sitting with a schedule and saying, right, because the trustees have a discretion, they can pick and choose which of their beneficiaries they benefit each year. And we're saying, right, if we're just looking at the tax, this is the way it will work. Because as children get older, so some of them might go beyond this, because the trust doesn't come to an end just because school fees are no longer relevant, but university fees, living costs into the world of work, you will then have some beneficiaries who will start to work. So you can mix and match how you distribute to them from the trust. And then ultimately, if you say, right, the trust has come to an end, you might want to distribute the whole lot out. There would at that point be some inheritance tax considerations to look at. But we won't go into all the intricacies of that. But you've created a pot for the benefit of grandchildren, which can be done tax efficiently and with an element of control. And I think those are the two elements that people really latch onto. And when you're talking to people who haven't come across this, they think, oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, and I think also because after 7 years, it's outside your estate for inheritance tax purposes. I think another bonus is that if say you're in your sort of mid-60s thinking about setting up a grandchildren's trust, or you're thinking about how can I benefit my grandchildren for their education, you might only have 3 grandchildren at that point. So by setting up a trust, you can say, I would like all my grandchildren to benefit, and therefore you're sort of future-proofing it for more grandchildren to come along the way. And also it's an equal pot that can be shared amongst them.
Absolutely. And I think also people instinctively like the fact they are doing something whilst they're still around. But it's not all done through their wills, but they can see the benefits as they're enjoying sort of spending time with their grandchildren. So it just feels like a good thing to do, and is a good thing to do financially and more generally.
And I mean, going back to what we both said about surplus income, if you put your 650 between husband and wife into the trust, and then each year you have the surplus income, and I've got clients that once we've done their tax return, we'll work out what their surplus income was for that year, and then that surplus then goes into the education trust.
Yeah.
So that's sort of increasing the pot for the future generations, but also in a very tax efficient way, because if you're sort of in your mid 70s to 80s, you don't really want to be increasing your own sort of inheritance tax exposure.
No, that's right. Yeah, and as you said, that surplus income is not subject to the 7 years, and I guess in simple terms, because IHT is a capital tax, and what we're talking about is income. So straight away you make that gift out of your estate, not subject to inheritance tax, because it's an income gift. So one of those things that in some ways is almost too good to be true, but it's there.
But for the moment, it is.
For the moment, there are threats. We can get onto the politics of changing governments. There are thoughts around, well, should that be as generous as it is, and should it be limited in some way? So it is a case of watch this space for sure. But right here, right now,
I mean, there are another couple of traps that that I think people should be wary of. In my sort of previous experience, where either the trust has been set up or a grandparent has just started settling fees directly without sort of any consideration for the tax implications. So one would be to make sure you keep records, because in case it does fall within the surplus income.
Yeah.
And then the other point was that I've had where a trust was set up, but for example, our fees. Each year the settlor decides to pay them personally, and so that needs to be taken into effect, because that's actually in addition to the trust. But then if it's surplus income, then it's okay. So you just need to, there's a few things you just need to, payment of the tax, for example, needs to really come from the trust, not from you. So you need to think about that. You did also mention about the 10-year charges, where you can have the payment, a tax payment of up to 6%. You can have in the first 10 years, it may be that the trustees or the grandparents might say, actually, we can disband this trust now, at which point there wouldn't be any inheritance tax as long as certain conditions were met at the start of the trust. So that's a valuable thing to think about, as well as, do you disband it? But again, harking back to the control point, do you want, the assets wouldn't go back into the names of the grandparents, but do you want that control to be held by the beneficiaries, depending on their age and their requirements? Because I think, as we discussed the other week, Mike, you can make a gift, but you can't then really stipulate what they do with that gift.
No, so an absolute gift, it's gone, isn't it? You might be sitting on the sidelines watching that money being spent in a way you don't approve of, whereas the trust gives you the ability to say, right, it's ring fenced, it is for the benefit of my grandchildren, but I can judge at what age I think they're sensible enough for me to release the money. Or you say they've reached that stage of, say, a deposit for a house, in which case the trust could provide that. And that's control with flexibility that a lot of people are attracted to. Because obviously, if you're paying a deposit for a house, then that's not money that can just be wasted away.
And if people are listening thinking, well, that's all well and good whilst I'm alive, and being able to have this control, I think it's key that the grandparents or the people who settle the trust can write a letter of wishes, sort of expressing what they want the funds to be used for. And if they say, fundamentally, I don't want it to go towards a house purchase, just education, then that's up to the trustees to take that into account. Yeah,
and then they can pick younger trustees. So you might have grandparents picking their own children to be trustees of a trust for the grandchildren, so that you don't have trustees all of a similar age and getting more and more elderly. So trustees can be replaced, but it's people you trust, and within a close-knit family, you'd say, well, I can trust my children to administer this fund for my grandchildren. Not in every case, but or you use an advisor. Quite often we will have clients where we act as trustees. Or
if you have a sole trustee who's a settlor, it's always advantageous to have a second trustee, whether it be a professional trustee or not, because should the worst happen, then you want at least some form of continuity if the beneficiaries are needing funds in the period of administration.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And so, Mike, would you like to remind the audience of other matters to consider if grandparents are considering making gifts directly for the benefit of their grandchildren?
Yeah, the really simple ones are everyone can gift £3,000 a year. So that's not going to go a long way to school fees, but it's, again, for a married couple, £6,000 a year. In addition to £250 gifts per recipient. I guess that we're getting into sort of birthday and Christmas present territory there, aren't we? Wedding gifts of up to £2,500 per grandchild. You can tell that some of these haven't increased for years, because I'm guessing when they first came in, they were relatively generous gifts, but no longer. And we get into this whole discussion about fiscal drag, don't we? And we've talked about normal expenditure out of income. So those, again, those three limits take you outside the pet territory. So those small amounts you can get out of your estate are free of inheritance tax straight away. And then looking a bit more broadly, there are the concepts of junior ISAs, premium bonds, even pension contributions that grandparents could look at and say, well, these are benefits I can make in the ways we've discussed for my grandchildren. And there was the thing a few years ago now that said if you made the £2,880 net contribution, which grosses up to 3,600 into a pension for your grandchildren, then by the time they reach retirement age, they've got a pot of £1 million. I think you make contributions from 0 to 18. I have seen clients do that, but that to me feels a bit remote, because if you're sitting there watching your kid struggling to fund lifestyle cost here and now for your grandchildren, the fact they've got a pension pot in 4 or 5 decades time feels a bit remote to me. But if you do it, so I would say do that as well as some of these other things.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think the pension point is, we often raise it, and it's obviously a very tax efficient thing to do, but it is the benefit in a long time. You have to wait a long time till you get the benefit from it, and you might, as you say, you might need. It's more likely that the cash demand time for children, they're sort of buying a house, school fees tend to be the two sort of main times when they need funding. And if they're waiting till they're in there till 55, or if that age goes up, by that stage they've probably already bought their house and their kids might be in university still, but it's a long time to wait.
Absolutely. And pensions are a bit like eating your greens, and don't get my wife or daughter on that subject, because I'm very bad at that. Everyone knows it's good for them, but if you're talking to people in their 20s and 30s, they know they should be doing it, but do they do it? Well, I hope they do, because I'm more of that age where you think, yeah, you appreciate what you did back in your 20s and 30s in terms of pension provision, but there are things that are closer to home, I guess, for most people.
Well, I suppose talking about the other points, the junior ISA which is 9k per year, that's obviously beneficial. But then the problem is that when they reach a certain age, that money is then in the hands of the child directly, so there's no control. Premium bonds, I mean, I think they're a really good idea personally. But anyway, it's up to each individual, really, isn't it? As to what works best for them or what they feel most comfortable with.
Absolutely.
But also, sort of, I know we've been talking about sort of the inheritance tax, but as we've covered in other podcasts, if assets are being gifted instead of you giving cash, then people should also consider the CGT implications of this, because that also has a hit. But any other sort of closing tips, Mike, on gifting or school fees?
I think closing tips are have that family discussion. It sounds very earnest and serious, but do chat, involve the family, have a. It doesn't have to be very serious. It doesn't have to be a proper meeting, but talk it through, work out what in your family circumstances is of most benefit, so that you have had that, because until you've had that discussion, you don't know for sure. So have a family conversation, and then start to do some stuff. Take the proper advice. I know you'll say that in your sort of wrap up at the end. And we are here to help people, and we're talking to clients and prospects about these sorts of things day in, day out. So just give us a call and have a conversation about some of the more detailed points. But go for it.
Thank you. My points would just be looking at sort of various exemptions and things like that. As I mentioned earlier, key to keep the detailed records, so that you can sort of maximise your use of those where possible. and also consult with people, because it can be quite tricky, but this is our bread and butter. So, make sure you speak to an advisor to make sure you're getting everything you can in the best way. I'd also add that we've got a very useful fact sheet on our website, which covers all the topics that we've discussed today in more detail. So please do have a read, or if you've got any questions, do let Mike or myself know. So it leaves me now to say thank you Mike for joining me today. We work with a wide range of clients. Many are UK based and many live overseas but have interest here, whether that's property, business interests or investments. We advise individuals and families on how best to safeguard, maintain and enhance their wealth, and on the most appropriate methods of passing on that wealth to the next generation. We also help people comply with the tax rules in the UK, which can be complex. If you'd like to find out more about Saffery Champness and how we can help you, please head over to the Saffery Champness website at www.saffery.com. However, it's important for me to stress that if you're considering any of the topics discussed today, you must always take professional advice based on your individual circumstances. Thank you for listening.